We're now moving on to a section about challenging bullying and harassment. So can I invite Madeline Carter and Neil Thompson to come and give a presentation? They are both senior lecturers in occupational and organisational psychology at Northumbria University. Madeline's research has investigated workplace bullying in the NHS, professionalism in healthcare, selection into medical school and foundation training, and the quality and delivery of medical education in partnership with NHS organisations. Neil's workplace bullying research has explored the prevalence and experiences of bullying and examined the use of interventions in the NHS. He's also a board member of the International Association of Workplace Bullying and Harassment and a member of Drawing, which is a UK-based practitioner research collaboration focused on developing interventions to tackle bullying. They've an impressive list of clients they've worked for, including the Department of Health, the National Institute for Health Research, NHS Trusts, NHS England, both national and regional, the GMC, Medical Schools Council, NHS Employers, and the Royal College of Midwives. So they will have some wonderful insights to share with us. Madeline and Neil, welcome.
And I are delighted to be here. We've been engaged in workplace bullying research in the NHS for around 10 years, and really delighted to see the level of momentum and commitment to tackling this issue, which feels like it's really building. So we've covered this, and I think Anthea has sort of spoken to this as well, but we know that bullying is a persistent problem in the NHS. The latest staff survey results suggest around 22% of the medical and dental workforce report they've been bullied, harassed or abused in the last 12 months. That echoes our own research findings, which found similar levels of medical staff reporting that they've experienced bullying, and around half of the medical workforce saying that they've witnessed bullying. We know that there's a huge body of literature that talks to the negative impact of workplace bullying for individuals, for bystanders, for teams and for organisations. There's some quite recent meta-analytic data which is pulled across multiple studies and has looked at these relationships, and particularly focusing on psychological well-being and anxiety and depression, but also physical well-being. There's longitudinal evidence now, which is rather than cross-sectional. There's longitudinal evidence looking at supporting the argument that bullying is actually a causal effect on some of these health outcomes. Although interestingly, the reverse is also true, that people with pre-existing mental health issues may also have a higher prevalence of experiencing bullying. Researchers also looked at some of the work-related outcomes like absenteeism, job satisfaction, intention to leave and commitment, and found a negative impact there too. Critically though, the evidence is really building for the case around patient care and the negative impact that bullying can have there. So the studies showing that rudeness can affect diagnostic and procedural performance in medical teams. We know that bully trainees are more likely to report serious or potentially serious medical errors. And bullying has been implicated in several high-profile reviews of poor patient care. A very hot off the press recent paper, which I think is in your packs, by Roger Klein and Duncan Lewis also has recently estimated the annual cost of bullying to the NHS as being £2.28 billion a year. So it's a huge issue that we need to tackle. I just wanted to present a few quotes because Neil and I have been sort of gathering stories and narratives from the NHS for a number of years now, and this just gives it's a small sample of the many stories that we've heard from people who've experienced bullying and some of the negative effects. So for example, certain consultants undermined junior members of the team, belittling their efforts, were sarcastic and made junior staff feel worthless, minimal teaching but maximal criticism. There are also examples there of juniors delaying making referrals of patients for fear of ridicule or aggression, and performing things like serious prescription errors because people's inability to think straight in these situations. And unfortunately, the one on the end feeling that you're in an organisation of lies and bullying and people are frightened about what to do and what to say. So we have a challenge on our hands. We know that bullying is a persistent problem. There's a high prevalence of staff who are bullied themselves as targets, but also around half of the medical workforce saying that they witness bullying, or higher in some specialties like surgery. There are also significant barriers to reporting bullying, which Neil is going to talk more about. But unfortunately, we know that there's a perception that management don't take action, that these issues are just left, which is exacerbated by a high-pressure environment, which the NHS is, and compounded by organisational change, because both of these issues are associated with higher levels of bullying.
So we have this challenge, and how do we respond to this? We've always spoken from the floor about the range of policies that we have within the NHS, dignity at work, bullying harassment policies that are individual in their own right or incorporated into other larger policies. We also know that many NHS trusts have implemented some form of training at some point. We'd hope to have seen a difference over the last decade or 2 decades in the levels of bullying, but we haven't. So why is there still a problem? It seems to be that the interventions that we're using just aren't working. There isn't one singular reason for that. We can look at policies and why they aren't successful. We can look at individual organisational barriers, and I'll speak in a bit more detail about that. But certainly the nature of the process involves an uncertainty from those that are involved, and we've already heard that there's a great deal of negative experiences from those that go through a formal process. We have some other themes that I think are relevant, the use of zero tolerance statements, and also vexation complaints. So within our research, we have consistently heard these stories of barriers to reporting. We've already heard in the earlier speakers, the risk of career damage from reporting bullying is consistently reported to us. It's generally not worth reporting for fear of your career. The seniority is also important, so the person concerned being senior to the complainant. So we have individual level barriers to reporting, career concerns, fear of it being detrimental, the risk that not that the complaint leads to nothing, but also that the complaint might escalate the problem even further, make the bullying a bigger issue. The idea that by making a complaint, you get to be seen as the troublemaker. And generally there's a sense of a lack of trust in the process for those that are considering to take part. We know that those that are victims of bullying talk around a lack of support, a feeling of isolation. And so that lack of support is again an inhibitor to then taking the steps of a complaint. Associated with that, self-doubt. Is it me? Am I making something out of nothing? How are other people going to see the behaviours I'm experiencing? Am I going to be blamed for that experience? And inevitably, the concern around it's going to come down to their word versus mine. We know that the experience of the process at a formal level includes emotional distress, associated ill health, and just a negative emotional experience. We also see a range of organisational barriers to reporting. Simply the nature of the confidential process means that they don't know what to expect. There's lots of myths out there. Bullies, as we've already heard, are more senior typically. And often in policies, the guidance is raise your concerns with the immediate line manager. And if not them, the manager above them. We've already heard from the floor how challenging that is in terms of the culture. Also, the management levels often work very close together. So from the target's victim's point of view, they can be very much seen as a closed group. We hear stories of management lack of action or non-timely complaints, or actually non-adherence to the policy, so interpreting in a way that's ineffective. And finally, the notion of attributing the responsibility for resolving the issue to the targets. So dismissing something as a personality clash, or recommending that we have to resolve it between the parties, when often the target has little or very little to do with the behaviour placed against them. There's a range of negative experiences associated with actually going through a complaint process. We can see from the model being proposed that the formal complaint stage is really the failure zone. It's the bit where there's not going to be many winners. In one study, only 14% of complaints led to the bully being relocated or dismissed. And actually reporting a complaint can result in no improvement. or in some circumstances, worsening of job, psychological and health outcomes simply by going through that process. And those that report on their experiences will talk about feeling unwell or actually having to contain frustration or anger simply because they have to present themselves as an appropriate type of victim. And then we get into some of the more unpalatable ideas. The fact that there are unsackable employees who are critical to our businesses. So even if the bullying behaviours are proven, will the trust dismiss them? And it comes often down to how the target's expectations are and are they met. So we do see complaints processes that fail to tackle bullying. There are various explanations for this as ineffective complaints process. We've heard some of them already. The abuse of the process, the failure to manage the process, whether that's intentional or just simply a lack of capability from the individuals. But we can come to two real scenarios. Procedures that are so ineffective that few complaints are ever processed, or the organisation that is so proficient at defending themselves that complaints are never proven. In either scenario, the consequences are that any future employee is unlikely to then raise a complaint because they don't see that it's going to be a success. So certainly an act for organisations to take is to evaluate their policy usage, not just the outcomes and the number of outcomes, but their processes, the contextual factors that lead to the outcome levels. And now just to bring on to two themes that we think are interesting within the policies. And one is the use of zero tolerance statements, which could be seen as problematic for organisations, simply because they're conceived very differently. We have this absolute version where bullying behaviours should never happen. And this does make any process very adversarial. But we also have this symbolic notion of zero tolerance, which signals to everyone around that we take this issue seriously. And it allows for the scope for softening of the situations. For example, if there's a view that intent to cause isn't there, or the perpetrator was unaware of their behaviours, or situations which don't necessarily meet a threshold for dismissal. This may raise expectations of perfect behaviour all the time, and that those proven will be dismissed. But there's a consequence that organisations that don't meet those thresholds risk credibility, and that there's a use of the zero tolerance approach is just not lived up to. So healthcare organisations have had zero tolerance statements for a long time. They're featured frequently in policies. And critically, we just don't see any evidence that they are effective as a deterrent. But they could be problematic in terms of the expectations of those involved. In our conversations with organisations, we often quite quickly get into the conversation of malicious and vexatious complaints. Allegations made not in good faith for individuals' gains, and they're frequently in organisational policies. And their complaints are fabricated with potential intent of deliberately doing harm, of undermining, so upward bullying. Despite the frequency of them being in policies, there's not a lot of evidence, and there's certainly been no reviews around how frequently vexatious and malicious complaints occur. And there is a potential that there's a risk that a focus on these sorts of complaints, of the worry of false positives, hinders legitimate examination of complaints. Should we consider the policy and the complaint? Current focus is on dealing with individual bullies at an individual level. We already have spoken and we've already heard about the idea of bad apples, bad barrels. We focus very often at the individual level and neglect the environment and the cultural factors. Blame is often placed on individuals' bad behaviour, but the leaders, the senior leaders in organisations, are often the product of years of training, of development programmes, of socialisation within specific trusts. And the notion at individual levels is that the culture is omitted. Alternative management approaches are available in Australia and New Zealand that focus on workplace bullying as a health and safety concern, where the focus is on that this does not meet the acceptable level of service, and therefore it has a detrimental effect on the organisation. Rather than focusing on the individual, we focus systematically on making an improvement. And that lends itself more to the conversations we're seeing around the impact on patient care and the increase in errors.
Okay. So Neil's talked a bit about the barriers that individuals have to reporting bullying and the role of policy as an intervention approach. Organisations and trusts have a range of different approaches and interventions available to them. I've listed a few of them here, things like developing a code of conduct, engaging in team building activities, mediation, confidential peer support officers, coaching, mentoring, counselling. So there's a whole range of different intervention options. And one of the major ones, which I'm just going to talk a little bit more about, is training, because that's often used in these situations. So training, things like bullying awareness raising, focus it on the policy or conflict management skills. One of the issues that we have, though, with intervention, the evidence base is not strong. We don't have a lot of good data, good robust evidence on what works to tackle bullying. This is probably because it's a really complex issue. It's a multi-level issue. Often you have to put in place things at different levels, so it's quite hard to isolate the effect of a particular intervention to understand what works. But I'm going to focus a little bit on training. So I'm going to invite you to think about some bullying training that you might have attended over your time in your careers. So if you ever think about who actually attended and who engaged with that training, was it voluntary or was it mandatory? Was it perceived as a valuable way for you to spend your time by your colleagues, by your teams, by your seniors? And was it a one-off session, or was it integrated into multiple training packages, so things like leadership development or medical education more broadly? Or was it that one-off session? So when we're thinking about why some of our interventions don't work and why we're still faced with this issue, often we don't get engagement from the individuals that we really want to be on these training programs. They're often voluntary, and the people who need this sort of training the most often aren't there. It's also, we often get the message that it's not particularly valued by seniors. It's seen as box ticking, or it's a waste of time and you've got service pressures. And I think that gives an important message about how critical this issue is and how important it is to an organisation. Frequently as well, bullying training focuses on awareness raising. We talk about the policy or definitions, but really what we need to really do is give people the skills and confidence to actually be able to have difficult conversations, to challenge behaviours at that early stage, which is incredibly difficult to do. And I think sort of needs to be recognition that this isn't an easy thing for people to intervene in, given all the barriers we have to reporting. Also, training is often a one-off session, rather than being integrated across many organisational systems. And I think Henrietta mentioned this as well. Really, when you want to tackle a complex problem like this, you need to think about all of the organisational processes. So yes, training, but also who are you selecting? What are the criteria for promotion? How are you appraising people? What's the leadership development program like? What's the focus? And are we talking about conflict management skills and dealing with these behaviours early and prioritising that? And things like capturing data through exit interviews. So in terms of what we can actually do, if we wanted to improve some of our training programs, things like looking at a critical mass of staff. If you've got a large organisation and you train a really small proportion of them, then it's going to really dilute the effect of your training. People go back into an environment where those behaviours, those skills aren't the norm. Training content needs to be relevant and tailored. It typically has much more power if some of the scenarios used in these training resonate with people who are attending. Yes, we do need to develop a common understanding of what bullying is and what it isn't, and increase the awareness of the impact of our behaviours and try to get people to kind of think about their own behaviours a little more. Yes, that is important, but the really important thing is to increase this confidence in challenging behaviours from a target's perspective, but also from bystanders. I think the people around who can jump in and say, oh, there's something not quite right about that, I don't feel comfortable here. And sometimes it is providing a bit of a language and script that people can use, and that becomes a bit more of a norm to use to challenge behaviours. I think in terms of generally training sort of good practices, it's important to have follow-up sessions, have peer support so people can come back and say, I wasn't able to implement this training, I wasn't able to challenge people for these reasons, how can we move on in the future and monitor success? Also, I think the evidence base that's growing around the impact on patients can be really powerful too, to make that case about how important this issue is. And also something small like providing incentives. So if you made training, if it was required for promotion, for example. All of this, though, really needs to be set in a context where I think we've heard it from all of the speakers about the importance of leadership. So the really critical role that leaders have in shaping the culture, in saying what behaviours are ignored, what's condoned, what's rewarded, and that really sets the tone and sets the culture. So even if you have the most perfect training intervention, if it then goes back into an environment where those behaviours aren't supported, then it's not going to have a high chance of success. So just to end, Neil and I worked on an evidence synthesis looking at the data that's available around workplace bullying interventions a number of years ago. And the evidence base, as I said, is limited because of the complexity of this issue, but I think there are some key things which have come out in more recent reviews too. But the importance of taking a strategic multi-level approach, so not just looking at one level, like we're going to do a team intervention. You have to think what's happening at the organisational level, what's happening for individuals and support, what's happening with teams, and thinking about how we can prevent bullying, how we manage it when it's happening, and how we repair the damage once it's happened. As I've already said, the importance of ongoing leadership commitment and role modelling is critical. As Neil talked about, having a bullying policy that's relevant, it's clear, it's accessible, and it's consistently enforced is important, with, if it does lead to investigations, a timely response and good communication. That there's proactive monitoring and feedback. If you introduce training, it's to a critical mass of staff and you use effective processes. Again, if you can't do a critical mass of staff, then focus on leaders and managers because they've got the greatest scope to make changes here. They're the ones who have the ability to challenge behaviours more easily. So a point that I think Anthea made was around developing active bystanders, and it's something that Neil and I have a great interest in as well. One thing we find with targets of bullying is that they have eroded self-esteem, they've been repeatedly undermined, and it's incredibly difficult to have the confidence then to challenge behaviours. Bystanders, although they also experience negative impacts from bullying, have a really important role to play in validating an individual's experience, but also providing that support and starting to change the culture. And finally, ongoing promotion and publicity. So that's a quick summary of some of the research evidence in this area. And these are our email addresses, but we'd be delighted to take any questions.
Thank you both for that fascinating talk with lots of insights and new points that I hadn't considered before. Are there any questions from the audience? We've got time for a couple, I think. Lady in the green here, then Christina, and then over here.
Hi, Tracy Boylan. I'm doing some research around this with Middlesex University. And what surprises me, we're looking at the top 100 FTSE companies as well as the public sector as well. And bearing in mind it's such an issue and it affects in terms of healthcare, our core purpose of patient safety. Can't find anything anywhere where leadership has it as part of the risk management process. And when it's about factors can affect it like the environment, do you think there's a role for it being embedded within the risk management process?
Having sort of the...
Bullying being embedded in the risk management process?
Yes, yeah.
I think even up to this point, a few of the speakers and ourselves have talked around thinking about possibly in that context, and that bullying is a human factor because it has associations with damage to the team, individual, and therefore individual performance. So I think there's an argument that if you put it in the risk management process, it gives it a great deal more gravitas, and there's a target against it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's an argument for that. But I think that lends itself to what we're saying around integrated and strategic and led through leaders. Yeah.
Thank you.
Question further back.
Sorry, could you put your hand? Thank you. Excuse me.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. Because we spoke about it earlier and you mentioned it, I was just wondering, because you mentioned training staff, which is great, but what about medical students? has there been considered any training for medical students? And just saying, and not just medical students, maybe nurse students as well. For example, with medical students, they change so quickly from trust to trust that or from ward to ward, that bullying usually never gets mentioned from them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's actually a really important issue because there have been some research looking at bullying experienced by medical students. I know that I was actually recently involved in a curriculum review for medical school, and that issue was actually raised because we were sort of looking at how do we prepare future doctors to be in the NHS as a workforce and as a culture. And the issue of preparing themselves to deal with some of these issues actually did come up, and I think some medical schools are looking at trying to build that into communication skills training and how to manage feedback. It makes me quite sad though that we have to, in a way. I think, but that's the reality, and I think preparing individuals to face some of these issues and to know how to challenge behaviours is really important. It's a good point.
Hi, my name's Mukesh from Eastern North Hertfordshire NHS Trust. I'm just interested to know why smoking doesn't take place in any NHS trust. Doesn't matter what level you're working at or what stress levels you're working at. And there's no training, no conferences on smoking. And yet with bullying and harassments, it seems to be an issue that nobody challenges, even though there's conferences and training and terms and conditions, etc. So what's the difference? Is it a human issue, like you mentioned, Neil, or is it something that we need to address as the NHS as a whole?
I was going to say, sorry, we'll both have a go.
I think we talk a lot about culture, and that smoking is societally largely not acceptable in healthcare because we see the outcomes of that. Whereas with bullying, there are still sense of it's not always not acceptable. We see examples of that, of kind of rites of passage of I had it hard, so that's what to be a good surgeon is one of the examples. So I think there's barriers in that respect to start with.
Just one of the other sort of differences I think is the subjectivity involved. So if somebody's smoking or not, probably. But I think with bullying, you can have two people looking at exactly the same behaviour, and one would label it bullying and one wouldn't. And I think another speaker sort of mentioned people would be horrified in some situations to be accused of being a bully, and there's a subjectivity there which is different too. But I think people also I think Neil's point about looking at the culture and the pressures that are around is important, and looking at the environment. So people might not see themselves as a bully, but someone who's performing in an environment which is incredibly pressured.
Thank you very much. So please join me in thanking both Madeline and Neil for their informative talk. I'm sure they will also be happy to answer questions over coffee. You get nods from them. It's now time for you to stretch your legs. Coffee will be downstairs in the room next to where you registered. There are actually 2 rooms there, so don't all queue in the first room. There are coffee stations through in the second room and other stands to look at. But please be back for 11:30 because we're doing a completely different format after that, and we do need to start that on time. So enjoy your coffee break, but please be back promptly for 11:30. This morning's session on challenging bullying and harassment. And this afternoon, what we want to focus on a bit more is changing the culture to prevent bullying and harassment. So I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker, Caroline Elton. She's an occupational and counselling psychologist who specialises in career counselling for doctors. Since 1998, she's worked in medical education, first as an education advisor for Kent, Surrey and Sussex Deanery, and then setting up and running the Careers Unit, which is part of the Professional Support Unit in London. In 2018, her book, Also Human, The Inner Lives of Doctors, was published by Penguin. It was the Times Book of the Week and has excellent reviews, including from Atul Gawande, who called it crucial and timely. So we look forward to hearing your insights, Caroline. Welcome.
I I was delighted when Sally Brett contacted me and asked me to speak, and it's really a privilege to speak at the conference. I don't think I'd really figured that actually I've got the graveyard slot after lunch, postprandial dip starting to kick in, and also I'm following Performing Medicine, who I'd heard about before but hadn't actually seen in action, and you're absolutely amazing, so it feels like it's a really kind of a challenge to keep everybody attention to begin with. So I was going to say who I was, but that's already, Anthea's done that, and a little bit about the book, so I'll get cracking. I specialise in what I call complex career counselling. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that I see doctors whose career trajectories are complicated by health issues. That can be physical health, it can be mental health, it can be both, and they're complicated by health issues and or performance issues. When it's a performance issue, somebody, the doctor themselves, or sometimes somebody who's supervising them or managing them, thinks that things aren't going to par. As we've seen with the Performing Medicine earlier on in the day, when somebody, Matt, was not the consultant thought that there was a problem. You can see that the origins can be systemic, they can be due to the interactions that that doctor is undergoing, rather than actually being a limitation of the doctor. So I always, in whatever situation comes my way, I keep an open mind. I don't know what is causing that doctor to have problems. And a bit like in clinical medicine, doctors start by taking a history. In my work as a psychologist specialising in working with doctors, I take an educational and career history. And that is I have an in-depth exploration. I ask what jobs your parents do. I ask what jobs your siblings do. If your father is the professor of medicine, or if he is an unemployed day labourer, both of which I've encountered, that may impose different stresses and pressures on what's happening with your career. So I have a narrative-based approach to my work. I deal with stories. And in the course of hearing hundreds and hundreds of stories, I've heard issues related to race, to gender, disability, physical health, mental health, sexuality, religion, age, social class, nationality, and all sorts of other themes beyond. It's also really important to realise, to use what sociologists would refer to the term as intersectionality, that these different issues intermingle. They're not discrete. So that you can be black and female, you can be male and disabled and working class, all sorts of different ways in which these themes overlap. You'll have to apologise my maths. I thought I had 20 minutes. Turns out I've got 25. But if I only use 20, I don't think anybody will mind. But as it's a relatively short space of time, what I wanted to do was to give a richer flavour of how some of these themes work out in the conversations I have. So I'm going to focus just on two issues. I'm going to look at the issue of race, and I'm going to look at the issue of what I call role reversal, which is doctors becoming ill or doctors with a disability. Let's start with race. Just some basic stats. If we look, as many of you may know, the GMC every year publishes stats on the state of medical education and practice. And if we start with UK graduate doctors, the good news, and it is good news, that is in comparison to the population, medicine as a profession has more diversity than the population at large. That's great news. But we need to dig a little bit deeper. And we need to have a finer level of granularity. And within that, although there are doctors from Asian backgrounds, there are more doctors, people from Asian backgrounds in medicine than there are in the population at large. When we come to Afro-Caribbean doctors, for example, they're very poorly represented in the profession. And also more not so good news is that although entry to medicine for UK BME, particularly Asian doctors, they are well represented in the profession. We know from the work on differential attainment that once they're in, then problems can accrue and that the progress is not as smooth. My chapter in the book on this issue is called Risky Business, and it comes from my colleague Kath Wolf at UCL, who's done some great work on this issue, who talks about, race being an issue of risk to progression. And then if we look beyond UK graduates to international medical graduates, and remember, EEA, European Economic Association graduate area, are not counted as IMG. So we're talking about doctors who did not get their primary medical qualification in the UK or in the EEA. 39%, nearly 40% of the doctors in the register come from this group. And of those, approximately 90% of these doctors are from BME backgrounds. So over a third of doctors on the register are from BME backgrounds. Just imagine for a moment, if the Nigel Farages of the world got their way, who would look after us? The NHS would crumble. So the issue of how doctors, BME doctors, are treated and their experience in the workforce is not one of political correctness. It's not one of niceties. It is one absolutely essential to the quality of the service that patients will receive. So what are some of the things my clients have told me about? I call them clients, not patients. I'm not a doctor. You people blow people up. This was said to a UK graduate of Middle Eastern descent, apropos of nothing, when a group of them was standing in a ward looking at an X-ray of a patient. And just as we've seen with the earlier presentations this morning, he didn't know what to do. And actually what he did was worked harder and harder and harder. And the harder he worked, the more his colleagues saw him as somebody who was a bit different, who had no small talk, who wasn't a team player. And part of the work was just trying to get him to step back and see what was going on, and also to understand that actually it's intolerable to be working with colleagues who, apropos of nothing, will say, oh, you people blow people up. The first thing I became aware of in the UK was that I was a different colour. The second thing was that I spoke differently. This was an international medical graduate, Indian origin. She did have quite a pronounced accent. Her colleagues treated her as if she was stupid and as if she couldn't understand English. They never bothered to find out she was a voracious reader. And actually, she's now left medicine and she's doing a PhD in English literature, having got a first-class degree in English literature as the first step of leaving medicine, and that had always been her passion. But she was completely misunderstood. And this is a graduate, UK-born doctor of Pakistani origin, working-class background, brilliantly in her school in London, comprehensive in London. Her quietness was perceived as a lack of interest. Why? Well, I've got a clue why. And that's because her consultant the dean of her medical school, said to me, we have too many Asian girls in this medical school who are only interested in marriage. He didn't say that in a lecture theatre, he was the dean. He said it to me in a private conversation when I'd gone to have talked to him in my role at the professional support unit. And if that's not bad enough, this year in central London, a few months ago, I was speaking at a conference and there was somebody else, a very senior person from another London medical school. I wasn't talking about race, but I had a question about race. I referred to this incident, and the other person on the panel, senior person from another London medical school, misunderstood me and started then, when they got up to speak, talk about how they had too many Asian girls who are only interested in marriage in their medical school. I'm a bit sad that Dinesh Bugra is not here because I wanted to acknowledge his work, and you'll see why on the next slide. Cardiff University Medical School 2016, a group of students blacked up, one wore a large fake penis to impersonate a black senior lecturer. A group of students complained, and they were told there'd been a trigger warning, so what was the fuss? It nearly split the medical school. Some of the students involved actually left and got their places. This was 2016. In the end, after initially it was brushed aside, it was all a good joke, it was to raise money for Rag Week, the money was going for charity. Professor Dinesh Bugra, who is an expert, a world expert on issues of mental health and diversity, was called in to do an independent review. And of course, it wasn't just about a few rogue students with an inappropriate sense of humour. And actually, his report, he outlined all sorts of different issues. And that is always going to be the case, because there's another hero of mine, Professor Anis Esmail, who's a professor of general practice at Manchester, and if you want to go and look at his papers in the 1990s when he did fake CVs to see what happened, Everington and Esmail, with just all he altered with the names of people, and then looked at Smith versus Ahmed or whatever, and how they were received. That was back in the day when there wasn't centralized recruitment and selection. But I think the important point, and it explains why this is so difficult, is what happens in medical school is a reflection of wider society. And indeed, how could it be otherwise? Because medical schools and hospitals, they're not monasteries, they're not nunneries, they're not cut off, they are part of wider society. So in my work, I've heard about overt racism, I've heard examples of unconscious bias. In my book, I talk about an example of my own of unconscious bias. When my son, some of you may remember, a few years ago, there was an American guy who was an expert on Korea, who was giving an interview to the BBC, World at One or something, no, on telly, and his daughter wandered in, and then his son, who was about one, wandered in a baby walker, and he's trying to be really professional, and there's this domestic mayhem. And my son texted me and sent me a link and said, "Isn't this sweet?" Because I used to work from home. And he talked about the wife, because then there's this very harassed woman of Asian appearance coming in to grab these two children, kicking and screaming out. And I texted back, "Not wife, nanny." And my unconscious bias, there it was freeze-framed on a text. So we all do that on any number of different criteria, and we need to accept that. There's issues of stereotype threat. If you're not familiar with that concept, it's initially derived from fascinating work in Stanford University, and it shows how when people think that they are on the receiving end of being viewed through a negative prism, how the anxiety about that and also being preoccupied about that actually affects performance. And the key thing, social isolation, and the ways in which people from different groups, BME, doctors, can start to feel very isolated. And we saw that beautifully in the performing medicine work. Since March, I've had emails from all over the country from doctors, and actually also from doctors in other countries. And the majority of the response has been like Sally Brett was when she first emailed me about thank you for raising these issues. But there are also, of course, old school medics who have quite publicly, in writing, in conferences, just belittled what I'm doing and have denied that there is a problem and said I'm just talking nonsense. I think people who've come here today nobody is going to deny when they've got the report in front of them that there are real issues around bullying and harassment and around the issues of race. But I'm inspired by Michelle Obama. When they go low, we go high. So I'm not going to name names. The second issue is around role reversal, illness and disability. And I got interested in that I got interested in that. I'll go forward. When there was a doctor with a very significant physical disability who came to see me when I was still at the professional support unit at London Deanery. He'd made good progress through medical school and foundation, although interestingly, he got offers from 2 medical schools, one of whom only arranged, they said you've got to go through occupational health, because it was a significant disability. And they arranged the occupational health so late in the day that he would have had to have a gap year. He went to the other medical school, and he made very good progress. Slight wobble the first term, and basically he was doing too much, he was having too much of a good time and partying too hard, which I was very glad to hear about. But he made good progress in core training apart from one rotation. Day 1 on this one rotation, it was part of his core training. I don't know why this was ever allowed. And what I found fascinating, and this comes from really taking a detailed history, is that with this doctor, when he was so criticised, and there were consultants who clearly thought he shouldn't have been there were skills, practical skills, cannulation, for example, that he had done without any difficulty before, and yet in this placement he couldn't do it because they were just out to get him and to catch him out. Luckily, he had groups of consultants from earlier placements and some of the work that I did, and he was able to get his career back on track because it was his continuation in the core training program was really on the line. But he was the only doctor who didn't give me permission. He didn't respond to my email asking him whether I could write about him in the book. And that's why I'm just sketching it out in a very vague way. But he was the person who got me interested in it. And just going back, if you are interested in this issue, I can commend the book by a psychiatrist, Robert Klitzman, called When Doctors Become Patients. And he explains he got interested in this issue because his sister was killed she was in the World Trade Center. She was killed in the 9/11. And a few months after that, he became seriously depressed, a depressed psychiatrist. He couldn't see it. He couldn't see that he was unwell. It took him a long time to recognize that and get treatment. And then he got treatment, he recovered, and then he became interested in this whole issue. It's a fairly academic book, but it's really excellent. So my client with a physical disability is what got me interested. Then I had a client who was an obstetrician whose own fertility treatment was failing. And her consultants, who were fertility experts, who treated other women with infertility, basically said to herself, what's the problem? You can't get pregnant. You know, this has no bearing on your work as an obstetrician. You have to deliver other women's babies, and the fact that you can't pregnant is irrelevant. So how can we understand this? I don't personally think, and since getting involved in this issue about health, doctors with different physical health and mental health issues, I don't think it's because doctors are callous, and that's not what I think is going on. I think it's because, instead, I think this happens because the culture of medicine emphasizes the difference, the split between doctors and patients, and makes it very difficult for doctors to inhabit the middle space. And a kind of sense of this comes from something that a psychiatrist, Norman Straker, wrote about with his experience of dissection. I now believe that this frightening experience, and luckily, I think students get much better preparation for dissection now, but he just explains this notion of the split. I now believe that this frightening experience with no preparation began the unconscious defensive split between the patient and me. Cadavers, our first patients, they were referred to as the first patients, were made very distinct from us, the healthy, immortal medical students. Our defense against death, our specialness was being established. So, in other words, there's a culture which reinforces the split between doctors and patients, so that doctors don't have to deal with the frightening reality that anything that happens to a patient could happen to them or to somebody they love. And another example of this, and I know that Jocelyn Cornwall worked closely with Professor Kieran Sweeney, who was a professor of general practice, who died very young of mesothelioma. And he wrote a brilliant, brilliant piece in the BMJ called Mesothelioma in 2009, where one meets the most senior clinical staff, one is left with a sense of technical competence, undermined, with some notable exceptions, by hesitation to be brave. Eye contact is avoided. When one strays off the clinical map onto the metaphysical territory, I am a man devoid of hope, and circumlocution displaces a compassionate exploration of my worst fears. Perhaps as a doctor, I present an unusually severe challenge to fellow clinicians. I am too much like them. So where does this take us in terms of understanding and meeting doctors' needs? I'm not a huge fan of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but I think actually for this purpose it can be quite useful. The bottom is physiological needs: food, water, rest. And some of you may be aware, and this is another great hero of mine, Mike Farker, who is a sleep medicine specialist at the Evelina Hospital in London. And he has spearheaded the HALT campaign: hungry, angry, late, tired. And this is about taking breaks. And that is, of course, the physiological needs at the bottom, but also it's a rare example of doctors applying their specialist knowledge, he's a sleep medicine specialist, to themselves rather than just only applying it to their patients. And I think that we just have to have more recognition of the fact that medical work, it's not only hard from a cognitive point of view, and it's not only hard if you're doing procedures or you're a surgeon from a hands-on skill point of view, it's hard from an emotional, from a psychological point of view. And so Maslow, beyond the physiological needs, are actually safety needs, which I haven't really talked about. But an earlier speaker this morning talked about the fact that when somebody raised concerns, people actually said, well, you're walking across the car park at night. And of course, doctors can feel at risk their safety, not only if they complain and how their colleagues may behave, but also, of course, from aggrieved patients, aggrieved relatives, and we know that complaints are linked to race, and that BME doctors are more likely to be on the receiving end of complaints and of abuse. So actually, safety is important. But beyond the physiological needs and beyond the safety needs, what is vital is that doctors feel two things: that they have the skills and the resources to accomplish their work, and that there are others who they can turn to. And this is really the heart of the matter, because I believe that bullying and harassment corrodes both of these two things. It corrodes the sense that you can have the skills to do the work. It may also corrode your resources if you feel unable to ask for other people for help. And it certainly makes you feel much more isolated. So, some very tentative conclusions. We always need to bear in mind that medical work takes an emotional toll. And I think that any initiative has to be predicated on that basic understanding. And it's a simple understanding which often gets lost. HALT when one's hungry or angry, one's running late, when one's tired, makes it all much harder. We know, for example, that resorting to unconscious stereotypes is much more likely when you're tired and you're overburdened. Feeling isolated and that one isn't up to the job can be particularly corrosive given the demands of the work. My husband's a publisher, and I often think about, what happens to him on a bad day? Well, his book doesn't win the Booker Prize. It was shortlisted, didn't win the prize. He was really cross that a rival publisher did. It would be very hard to see how he could kill somebody or how anything really, really terrible could happen in his work. But in the work that the clinicians are doing, doctors and all their colleagues, if things go wrong, boy, oh boy, can they go wrong. and the implications of that can be appalling. So feeling isolated, that one isn't up to the job, can be particularly corrosive given the demands of the work. All doctors are likely to need additional support from time to time. When I take these histories, when I hear their stories, there are just so many reasons. There can be a family bereavement. There can be a breakdown of a relationship. There can be personal illness or illness of a child. Or so many, because doctors are human, which is why I called my book Also Human. Not only human, importantly, because also it's about the shared fact that they are human, as is their colleagues and as are the patients. So we need to be working towards a culture where it is the demands of the work are understood, and also the fact that all doctors are likely to need additional support from time to time, and certain groups may need more than others if they are to thrive at work. And this should be normalised, and that's really the key word, and built into the structures of medical training, and not only medical training, because these issues don't stop once somebody has got their CCT. They're actually relevant throughout the whole of somebody's career. So I hope that in this way, that we can start to be paving the way to new ways and leaving the old ways behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. What we're going to do is have all 4 lectures, and then the lecturers are going to come up here on a panel so we can do questions as a group.